Does the idea of landing on a glacier in the middle of nowhere scare you? In today's episode of Aviation Intrigue, we're going to talk about that, why people do it, and all the motivation behind it.
This is aviation intrigue.
Okay, most people know about runways. They're made of asphalt, concrete, a mile or two long. Is that how all the runways are?
Remember, we talked about in episode 5 that that's the runway most of us see. You fly on an airline, and the runways are actually more like 2 miles long, and they're huge swaths of concrete and asphalt for airports. But we also pointed out that the majority of airports across the country and across the world are actually a lot smaller than that, and some of them aren't even paved.
Yeah, I think we talked about at least 5,000 plus public use airports just in the US alone. And plus, I think something like 14 or 15,000 private use airports that may or may not have these, let's call it traditional runway configuration.
Yeah, that is amazing. When I found out there could be triple the number of private use airports, because remember, there are some that aren't even charted anywhere. So there could be many times, and the majority of those actually aren't paved at all. They could be grass, which is actually pretty common even for a regular airport, gravel, or even dirt.
Okay, gravel, dirt, grass. That's interesting. Tell us more.
Sure. If you look at the public airports that are not associated with an airline, and we talked about that in a previous episode, there's a lot of municipal, local, county airports that may have one runway, two, or even more, but they're pretty well suited for the lighter aircraft. Sometimes the 2-seaters, 4-seaters, 6-seaters. Okay, well, some of those runways aren't paved, and it's very common for a small percentage of those airports to have an additional grass runway that has no pavement on it. And that is actually made for light aircraft. Again, the 2 and 4-seat aircraft that you and I fly for fun and for flight training.
So these grass runways, they look like runways pretty much, except they're not paved. They don't have concrete or asphalt surface. And many of them have markers indicating where the runway is. So from when you're coming into land, you can sort of see the markers and know approximately how the runways are lined up. And you will land pretty much similar to how you land in a regular runway.
Sure, even though they look like a grass meadow, usually you're going to see a nice strip shaped, rectangular shaped with markers, just like any other runway. But the difference is they're not going to have paint on them. They're not going to have center lines. They're not going to have numbers. So you have to look at the map to know what runway you are using, how long and wide it is. But it is still a regular runway. And we call those soft runways generally, or unimproved runways.
Okay, your home airport only has a grass runway. It doesn't even have a paved runway, right?
Yes, I'm based at an airport that has one grass runway. It's about 150 feet wide and about 3,000 feet long. So we'd call that maybe a smaller to medium runway, but that will accommodate any number of light aircraft. And the ironic thing is it has a paved taxiway, believe it or not. Someone decided to put pavement in on the taxiway where all the runway is grass, because pilots who fly on grass and are very experienced with that love flying on grass. It saves the brakes. It's a nice soft landing, and it's a lot of fun to show people how to do that.
I agree. I mean, landing on grass is always fun. You need to have the proper airplane. There are some airplanes that are better suited for landing on grass, some are not. However, the big challenge is if it rains, if it's muddy, if it's snow, if it's slushy, it's easy to get stuck. Therefore, your technique of landing and takeoff is very different than landing on an asphalt.
Yes, definitely. Some of these grass runways aren't plowed. If you live in a place where winter happens and there's snow, there are plenty of grass runways that are plowed in the winter, just like they would plow the pavement so that airplanes can come and go. So there's a seasonality to that. And you mentioned rain. Some grass runways can get a little too wet or too soft for a lot of airplanes to safely take off and land on. Now, if you have a particular kind of small airplane that's got you've heard of the tail draggers with the tail wheel in the back of the airplane, and that raises the nose of the front of the airplane, and that is a little bit more amenable to unimproved or unpaved runways. So sometimes they can land when it's a little soft or a little muddy or a little snowy, but it really depends on the aircraft. If you have a well-kept airport with a well-kept grass runway, most of the time it isn't a problem. And you and I know that pilots who start out with their pilot training actually learn how to land on soft fields, even though they may not actually land on grass. They are taught how to do it because there's a little bit of a different technique in landing, but they all get that type of education in case they end up landing on a grass runway. They are fairly common.
Yeah, in the previous episode, when we spent a whole day at our glider club, after the landing, you'll notice that it was bumpy. It was a really nice, maintained, well maintained grass runway, but still it's bumpy. So there are some quirks associated with grass runway, and certainly there are technique differences that you need to be aware of. That's true in a mud and gravel runway also.
Yes, some of the rougher runways are going to be made up of gravel or mud or dirt. It's not quite as nice as grass, but you're right. The grass can hide the bumps even if it's well mowed and well maintained. So it's just something with gaining the experience and knowing the local airport. And we also like to ask the local pilots, hey, I'm going to your airport tomorrow. How is it after a rain? How's the bumpiness of the runway? It's good to have that information ahead of time, of course.
Yeah, that's a good point. Especially if these are not charted, you won't be able to call ATC and find out this. You literally have to call the owner of the plane, owner of that airstrip to find out the condition. And people who do have their own private airstrips tend to have these unimproved surfaces rather than paved surfaces.
Yeah, so we talked about the thousands and thousands of private airstrips out there. I would say the vast majority of those are going to be unpaved versus the public airports where the vast majority are paved or have at least one piece of paved runway. And so if you're going to have your own airport, it could be something like even a farm field that you've carved out or a piece of land that is cleared out for a landing strip. But most of those will actually be grass, but dirt is a little bit more common even with the private airstrips. So some of those uncharted private strips you definitely have to have permission to land on, but a lot of those have multiple pilots, multiple aircraft flying in and out. And if you are interested in experiencing grass runways, there's lots and lots of public airports that have at least one of those grass runways. And by the way, states often list those public airports and point out the ones that are grass because pilots actually like to seek those out. We also talked about on the airports episode the fact that some airplanes don't need runways at all, like seaplanes. There are a lot of public seaplane bases around the country and around the world, and sometimes a seaplane can just pick a place to land on a body of water.
Yeah, and what makes it interesting is, and last time we talked about how I like to fly in winter, and we talked about seasonality of flying. In winter, some of these lakes can freeze over, and it becomes literally like a landing on ice. So it becomes an ice runway.
Those are really cool. There are a couple of famous ice runways in Minnesota and New Hampshire, and I'm sure there are many others across the country where they do have frozen lakes in the winter, where they will actually turn a seaplane base or even just a local lake into an actual runway where the regular airplanes with 3 tires can land on in the winter once it's frozen hard enough, and they will actually groom a little landing strip out and tell everybody to come on down.
Yeah, it's similar to the grass runway we talked about. It's not really paved, obviously, so there's no paint but they may be marking cones or some way of indicating where the runway is. Alton Bay in New Hampshire is a very famous ice runway that obviously is seasonal. It only exists in the winter, and it was very close to. Previously, I used to live in upstate New York, and it wasn't that far. And I know a lot of people who go and land there. And landing and departing is very similar. You take your own regular airplane and you land, and instead of landing on grass or asphalt, you're landing on a sheet of ice. It is kind of thrilling, I think.
I still would love to go to Alton Bay because that probably is the country's most famous ice runway, and the fact that that is a temporary runway where they have to check the ice to carve that out every year and then let people know whether it's okay to land there sounds really cool. I would love to land there sometime.
It's the braking action is what you have to worry about, because the moment your wheel touches down, you need that brakes to kind of keep you straight and being able to stop. And in fact, I never landed in Alton Bay, but I have landed in ice covered runways before.
I have too.
In a place called Bennington, Vermont, which wasn't that far from the place I used to fly out of. And what we do, or what we did, is do a low pass flyover over the runway. You physically observe, because there's no air traffic controller, there's no control tower to ask. So you can broadcast to see if anybody landed and what the braking action is. But we just flew very low, like maybe like 5-10 feet, observing it physically. And then when we come back, we land, and you got to be extremely careful, because The problem is not landing. The problem is what happens after you touch down. Anybody who has driven in ice and snow knows exactly what this is when you start to slip and skid a little bit.
So the safest condition for an ice runway would actually be to have a little bit of dry snow on top and to have it so that it's not wet or slushy. Is that your experience from landing on the ice?
Yeah, you still need to make sure that you're keeping, as instructors, Elaine, we harp on keeping on the center line, and we keeping the plane flying down the runway parallel to the center line, if you will. And that's even more important because any slight angle when you land might make you slip. So yes, a little bit of slush, just like mud, might help you steer. Otherwise, it's just a sheet of ice. It's like ice skating rink.
I've landed on snow-covered, frozen over lakes where it's good to have a little friction and kind of know the surface from experience, because you can fly over it to check for holes and bumps, obstacles, things like that. And then once you land, like you said, you want to be lined up really well, and you also want to be slow enough so that there's no reason to slam on the brakes, because just like in a car, that can cause a skid. And so it does take some pilot skill and some practice in making sure that you're at the correct speed and the correct angle touching down, and by the way, you know how to finesse the brakes while you're coming to a slow stop.
We also have a lot of friends and people we know who fly with skis. So instead of wheels, in the winter, they put skis on and they fly. Now they can land on ice runways, they can land on snow covered runways. And in the next segment, we'll talk about how maybe even you're landing on not even a runway.
Not even a runway. We're getting there. You mentioned ski planes. They're a lot like seaplanes, where they can land at an airport and they can land anywhere else where there's a smooth swath of snow that's long.
On the other side, we can even land on dirt where it could be middle of nowhere. It could be a dirt runway. And we talked a little bit about gravel runways. It's kind of like a grass runway, except it's dirt. It may be just packed mud.
I've never landed on dirt or straight mud, but you've traveled and seen some places where dirt runways are pretty common.
Yeah, it is. I never personally landed, but I was in a small airplane when we did a safari in East Africa. So this was
Wow.
primarily in Kenya and Tanzania, and we landed in the middle of Serengeti. Serengeti, it's
Wow.
all grasslands.
That is so
Literally,
cool.
yeah, you're flying. All you see is buffaloes and bisons and giraffes and stuff like that. And then suddenly the pilot declares there's a runway. You don't know that from anything else. It's just a horizontal, I don't know, a rectangular marking. And we landed, and most of them are not just mud or packed dirt, but it's also very small, it's not very long. So the braking action, again, being able to stop, turn, everything is very, very important. Very interesting, actually.
Wow, that is an amazing place to be in an airplane, and to see that these dirt strips are what you use. It sounds like that it was dry, though. I mean, assuming that if it was a rainy season, that would have been just solid mud. I wonder if that's even okay to fly around like it in that kind of
Yeah, I
season.
don't know. I don't know. When we flew, it was pretty dry, and the only thing we had to worry about is wild animals on the runway. So the plane had to come in, sometimes fly very low, chase away these buffaloes who
Wow.
are just happily sleeping on the runway, and then come
Wow.
back and land.
So it's kind of an airport, but nothing how we would know an airport. There's no fences, no numbers, nothing of that. And here you are having to chase off the wildlife before you can land. And like you said, this sounds like this is in the middle of nowhere.
It is. It's a landing strip associated typically with a game farm or where we go to watch wildlife.
Wow. And in the next segment, we'll talk about how it gets even sportier than that.
I know. I can't wait. So we began with traditional runways, asphalt, concrete. Then we talked a little bit about grass runways, dirt runways. Then we talked about seaplane landing bases and ice covered runways. Now I'm very interested in transitioning into where pilots land, where it's not even a runway. You cannot call it a runway in any sense of the word. I'm talking about landing on gravel bar in a riverbed or on glaciers and things like that.
Wow, and we'll also talk about who would do such a thing because there are actually very regular looking airplanes that are capable of doing this. It sounds like you've seen the glacier landing process in your travels, Gopal.
Yeah, so in one of our trips to Alaska, we landed on a glacier. That was
Wow.
fantastic. Of course, there's no runway, there's no marking. Literally, you're landing on a glacier and taking off from a glacier. So it's kind of like a landing on a lake, mountain lake, or something like that. But it was a fascinating experience because you're so used to looking for airports or control towers or runway markings, lights, and all those things. None of them exist. It's just wild Alaska.
So this is a step beyond that dirt strip in Africa that you had mentioned. This isn't even a strip.
Yeah, you can say that literally. I think they can land anywhere, but I'm thinking that the pilot has local knowledge because obviously the glaciers can have gaps or cracks, and you don't want rocks, you don't want falls. So you want still a flat surface to be able to land and take off. So I'm going to assume that either there are charts that exist or there's a lot of local knowledge. Not that different than a whitewater rafting guide that who knows the river really well, where the rocks are, where the river bends, and all kind of things like that.
Sure. So if I've landed on an ice runway, but then I want to go to Alaska and land on a glacier, it sounds like that's not something I should just jump in and do, right? It takes some training, takes some experience, and maybe going up with a knowledgeable pilot is the first step because I can picture a glacier with a huge slope on it that goes into the ocean. That's not something I know too much about.
Yeah, needless to say, this probably is a good place to insert a disclaimer. We are not doing a flight instruction here. We highly recommend if you want to fly and land on an ice or snow or in Alaska on a glacier, seek proper professional instructor, get the proper instruction, get trained on the ground and in flight, and make sure that you get local knowledge. So this is all we are sharing our experience, nothing more than that. But you're right. You're right. I don't think we should just go fly there. Just like I don't think I'll go fly over the mountains of Colorado without getting a high mountain experience because there are both known and unknown dangers associated with some of these terrain.
And some of the backcountry airports in areas like that where there is terrain will have short runways with hills all around them. There'll be gravel, there'll be dirt. We talked about the unimproved airports. They're actually more common in places like that where the runways can be pretty tricky. So training is definitely a must.
Yeah, for sure it's tricky because we talked about wildlife. There could be trees on one end. It could be prevailing winds that the locals know which way the wind is coming. So therefore, even though a runway you can theoretically land on both sides, one way may be highly preferred. If not, that's what you should do because the winds are favoring or there's big giant trees or big giant rock or big giant hill straight ahead. So the local knowledge is so critical. And otherwise, you can get yourself in and get this. In most cases, you may be able to successfully land the aircraft, but taking off is a different thing because situation, with the conditions you need for takeoff may be very, very different than when you're landing.
Oh, that's right. We can't just think about the landing, right? The landing in these cool glaciers or backcountry strips. You've got to think about how do I get out of here and maybe do that before you land. Would that be a good idea?
I think that'll be a very good idea. Unless this is your move and you're going to live there, then all good.
Live in your airplane that's not getting out of the strip. We hear about these one way in, one way out, unimproved airports or glaciers, sandbars, and that is something that definitely requires local knowledge and some background in that type of flying because this is definitely a far cry from those regular airports that we use every day. That's for sure.
Yeah, unfortunately, I'm on the boring side of flying, so I haven't done many of this adventure thing other than being in an airplane like in Alaska or Africa. But I admire the people who do this either for living or this is their lifestyle. I used to watch the show called Flying Wild Alaska. It was fascinating. The winds are howling and you don't have a marked runway. It's dark most of the year, and the runway condition, the airport conditions are not at all what you're used to.
Yeah, snow and ice is just a normal thing when you're flying in a place like that. That's definitely the case, and yet People will do this for fun. You talked about gravel riverbeds. I have some practice only on grass, so only on nice Midwest grass runways, flying with Tundra tires. Have you ever seen those? They're 31-inch tires. They're huge, and they are actually built to land on rocks. And so my next step will be to get some backcountry training so I can use those tires to land on a gravel bed. That is something I definitely want to do.
Yeah, that's a good point because in addition to training, you need to have the proper aircraft with the proper equipment. Otherwise, you're going to make a situation really, really bad that could end up a lot worse. So it may be the tires, it may be the power of the airplane, it may be the how much runway you need for takeoff. All those conditions need to be studied upon. So the question is this even the right thing to do? Is there a danger associated with this?
Well, we talked about some of the dangers and the fact that you need the right type of aircraft, the right type of training, the right type of weather that day, the right type of environment the day you're going to do that. But again, people are out there doing it because that's their job, and people are actually seeking these places out for fun. So the question is, who would do that?
So I think people who go hunting in the middle of nowhere, this is maybe the only way to get there. There are a lot of people who fly missionary planes up in Papua New Guinea or in the middle of forest, where you're literally landing in a landing strip in the middle of mountain, in the middle of forest. And if you have a cabin that you are going to be spending months on end, some of these places, I think we mentioned this in a previous episode, properly equipped airplane with properly equipped pilot may be the only way to get in and out of it because there's no train, there's no road, there's no other way to get in.
That's definitely a case for places like Alaska, where this type of transportation is actually crucial for people getting around, not just for the tourism industry, but really for functions like medical care, transportation into the cities, places like that. So it's actually a really, really important part of general aviation to have pilots who can do that. And as far as the fun part, there's a lot of hunting, fishing places, like you mentioned. You can only get in and out of some of these remote places, either on a gravel runway or just landing on a gravel bed, or seaplanes for that matter. And so that is a really neat area for anyone to learn how to fly in those conditions. It definitely takes some skill.
We had an episode on air medical missions. Sometimes those helicopters have to land in very, very non-traditional places in order to rescue somebody or in order to retrieve a patient that needs medical care. So sometimes you're doing this because you need to do it. Sometimes it's recreational, sometimes it's job related. But Elaine, this is what fascinates me about aviation. You can go from airline in a very traditional way all the way to this bush flying, to this backcountry flying, and everything in between. It's a fascinating world.
It is, and you never stop learning. Sometimes you come across something that you didn't even know about. I didn't realize that tires could be that big on a 2-seat airplane until I saw them and decided to give it a try. Just making these discoveries as a pilot, and whether you do it for recreation or for a job, is never ending. And that's why we like to talk about these things. Have you ever been in an airplane that landed on a non-paved runway? Share your stories with us.
This is